Hello, welcome to part 4 in a series of videos on notation and terminology in vibrational astrology. And we are now up to the midpoint isotrap, one of the very most important, powerful planetary configurations, extremely important. I think I made, I think I made the point. This is just something you cannot overlook. And it's easy to overlook it. It doesn't look dramatic when you're looking at your midpoint structures. Let me show you what you'll see. Let's go to the Sirius software. Here again is Julia Roberts, the actress. We've been looking at her chart, and I've already selected her midpoints, so they're over here under the report selected. There are the midpoint structures. Oh, let me get rid of the midpoint listing because I don't know. We don't normally need that. Yeah, keep it simple. So there are the midpoint structures. She's got what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 midpoint structures, right? Sun is at Mars, Jupiter. Mercury makes 2 midpoint structures. Mercury's conjunct Sun, Neptune, and it's conjunct Mars, Pluto. Midpoint, Pluto's conjunct Venus, Uranus midpoint, and Saturn is opposition Mercury, Jupiter midpoint. Now, when you look at this, what stands out? What stands out to you? Well, number one, anything with a small orb, Mercury conjunct Sun, Neptune midpoint, 11 minutes, that gets my attention. Saturn opposite Mercury, Jupiter, 29 minutes, still very strong, that's important. Pluto conjunct Venus, Uranus midpoint, 41 minutes, that's solid. The 1.5 degree orb, I'm not that interested in. That's, just barely made it. If it was 1 minute more, it wouldn't even appear. I'm not that interested in it. I'm not that interested in it. I mean, it's not that important. And this midpoint structure, Mercury conjunct Mars, Pluto, 1 degree, 2 minutes, it's there. I mean, it's there. It's a degree orb. But it's nothing like this 11-minute orb. Whoa, that's a huge difference. 11-minute orb, very powerful, very important. Now, okay, so orbs are important. What else? There's something else extremely important. Don't overlook it ever. It's extremely important. What it is this. And it doesn't look dramatic, but it is dramatic. What it is that I'm going to stretch this out. Should have probably done that before so you can read this better. Let me stretch it out. There, I should have done that before. Stretch it out beyond what, whoops. Okay. Oh, Mr. Clumsy here. Okay, there we go. All right, so you can read it a little bit better. Now, what else is important besides looking at the midpoints and seeing what the orbs are? What's important is this. Mercury makes 2 midpoint structures. And number one, it makes 2 midpoint structures. Number 2, all 5 planets are different. Mercury's conjunct the Sun, Neptune midpoint, and it's conjunct the Mars, Pluto midpoint. Mercury, Sun, Neptune, Mars, Pluto, 5 different planets, nothing's being repeated. That is extremely important, and that is what we call a midpoint isotrap, which I will now show you why the word isotrap is in there and, how this terminology comes about. But that's what I wanted to show you. It does not look dramatic when you're looking at the midpoint trees. All you see is that Mercury makes 2 midpoint structures, big deal. But when a planet, you see that focal planet at the top of the tree, and you see 2 midpoint structures, and the planets in those 2 midpoint structures are all different from each other. And in this case, the Mars Pluto's not extremely strong, 1 degree, 2 minutes, but it's an isotrap, and still we're interested in it. It's very important. Now, if that Mars-Pluto orb was down under about 15 to 20 minutes at most, then extremely important. So when a planet makes 2 midpoint structures, that focal planet makes 2 midpoint structures, and all 5 planets in those 2 midpoint structures are different, and the orbs for both of them are under, say, 15 or 20 minutes. Wow. Huge. And what does huge mean? It means that that's a vitally important part of the person. Extremely important. That's going to tell you what they do. It tells you how they're wired. And you would look at the planets, if you're doing this in a vibrational chart. Right now we're in the natal chart. But so if in the natal chart, it means it's just fundamentally important to the person. If it's in a vibrational chart, it's working in that vibration, and that quality of that vibration has the quality of this midpoint isotrap. Well, I'll show you in a minute why we call it midpoint isotrap. But it's when a planet, that focal planet, that planet at the top of the tree, makes two midpoint structures, and all four planets are different. So for Julia Roberts, this is strong. It's important. Is it overpoweringly the most important thing? Not quite, because the Mars-Pluto orb is not super tight, but it's solid, and it's definitely strong, and it's going to affect how she functions and what her talents and her personality are. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Here it is. This is it. So this is the Mercury, Sun, Neptune, and Mars, Pluto that we just looked at. I've enlarged it and I color coded it with Mercury in yellow, Sun, Neptune in blue, and Mars, Pluto in pink, because I want to make very clear what's happening. What's happening when a planet makes two midpoint structures, I'm showing in the chart wheel. Mercury at 13 Scorpio 53 is at the midpoint of Sun, Neptune, and it's at the midpoint of Mars, Pluto. That means that these four outer planets are in an isotrap. Now maybe this isotrap is not tight enough. You know, the orb between the Sun, Neptune midpoint and the Mars, Pluto midpoint, maybe it's a little bit wide, but it's still powerful. You're still getting a lot of resonance going on because Mercury is on the line of symmetry. I put that line of symmetry as a dashed line. So you have an isotrap and then a planet at the line of symmetry. Let me say that again with slightly different words. When a planet makes two midpoint structures, and all five planets in the tree diagram are different, what you have is you have an isotrap with a planet on the line of symmetry right in the middle of it. And there are a large number of angular distances that are fairly close to each other. The Sun-Pluto angle is very similar to the Mars-Neptune angle, and then the diagonal, the Mars to Sun, is similar to the Jupiter-Neptune. That's the resonances just from the isotrap. And then, of course, Mercury to Neptune and Mercury to Sun is the same by definition, because Mercury is the midpoint, and Mercury to Mars is similar to Mercury to Pluto. There's so many resonances going on. It's really phenomenal. And that's why this is a powerful configuration. So to read from our slide, the purple shape is an isotrap. Again, a planet making two midpoint structures means that those planets that are making the midpoints are forming an isotrap. And the dashed line is the line of symmetry of the isotrap. Mercury is on that line of symmetry, and that means that Mercury is making the two midpoint structures. Okay, let's read on the right side. A midpoint isotrap is a 5-planet configuration. Always has 5 planets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When a planet is the focal planet of two midpoint structures. It does not matter whether the focal planet is conjunct or opposition to two midpoints. In this case, they're both conjunctions. In other cases, one could be conjunction, one could be opposition, or both could be oppositions. Doesn't matter. Very powerful planetary configuration. And here, as I said before, if the focal planet forms both of these midpoint structures with a very small orb, then the other 4 planets form an isotrap. So if these orbs are very small, then in this case, those 4 planets making the midpoints, Pluto, Sun, Neptune, Mars, they would form a solid isotrap. All those angular distances would be very, very close. But even when the orb is big, like in this case, the Mercury, Mars, Pluto is about a degree orb, it's still a powerful planetary configuration. The orb, when all these orbs, both of these orbs are very small, that gets super powerful because the resonance becomes very clear and sharp. Okay. All right. So this, we don't need to go over all this. This is just saying you have to have 5 different planets. So if you have something like, this is important. So for example, Mercury equals Sun, Neptune, midpoint equals Mars, Pluto, midpoint. Is that an isotrap? Mercury equals Sun, Neptune, midpoint equals Mars, Pluto, midpoint. Well, that's the one we're looking at. By the way, the color coding here was just to show Mars and Pluto are pink, and I put them over here. And the Sun, Neptune, I made this bluish color just to show how all that's working. But what if you have Mercury is at Sun, Neptune, and Sun, Pluto? Mercury is at Sun, Neptune, and Sun, Pluto midpoint. The one planet, the Sun, appears in 2 midpoint structures. It is not an isotrap. In fact, what's going on is that there's a conjunction. Whenever you see a planet repeating, like Sun is repeated in this example, that means the other planets are conjunct. Neptune and Pluto are conjunct. And it is not an isotrap. Okay, so I already said that, but I just want to make it very clear. And also, when a planet is duplicated, like in this case Sun, what you actually have is Mercury at the Sun-Neptune midpoint, and Neptune's also conjunct Pluto, and it also ends up at the Sun-Pluto midpoint. I'll show examples of that in later videos in this series. But the main point here is that all 5 planets have to be different to be a midpoint isotrap, and the midpoint isotrap is way more powerful than if you do not have the 5 separate planets and you do not have, and therefore do not have, a real midpoint isotrap. Okay. So as long as everything is within orb, the midpoint structures are within 1.5 degrees, we call it a midpoint isotrap. Although the isotrap might have a fairly large orb, and we suspect isotraps require small orbs, but we still call it a midpoint isotrap, and there's still a lot of resonance going on. Okay. Now, let's go on to the next idea. Well, let's go back to Julia Roberts' chart. Her Mercury is at her Sun-Neptune midpoint. It's also at her Mars-Pluto midpoint. What if there were 2 other planets that Mercury was directly at the midpoint? Could certainly happen. You could certainly, and when you look at the midpoint tree, it's very simple. You're just going to see 3 midpoint structures. So with 3 midpoint structures, you have 7 planets, and all 7 planets are different. Wow, that is huge. If you ever see a planet making 3 midpoint structures, and again, it's very simple. You're just looking at the midpoint trees, and you see 3 midpoint structures, and all the planets are different from each other. And if the orbs are really small, this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Planet, let me say it again, planet makes 3 midpoint structures. All the midpoint structures involve different planets. The orbs are tiny. Suppose they're all like less than 20 minutes or less. That's huge, huge. That is a tremendous competency, ability, potential. Motivation is huge. And it usually does not get expressed in like wildly discordant ways. It can be extremely strong, and it can come out negative by going too far. It can be destructive, but it's destructive just basically by being going to extremes, just being overly active with that energy. So very, very, very powerful stuff. And these are things that get overlooked in most astrology because we're just looking at aspects. We're not even looking at midpoint structures. We're not noticing these things. These are the things that are the most important, most powerful by far. So what we need a name for it. If there was a third midpoint structure, it would be nice to have a way to tell somebody that I could explain it all out. I could say, well, Mercury's making 3 midpoint structures and all 7 planets are different from each other, so therefore it's making like bunches of isotraps. And it's like, whoa, that's kind of confusing to have all that explained. Why don't we just call it a triple isotrap? That's what we do. A triple isotrap is when you have 3 midpoints aligned, and a triple midpoint isotrap, I've got that down here later. Well, we'll get to it. All right, let me just come back here. Sorry. You're going to have a triple isotrap, and if there's a planet at the midpoint of it, it'll be a triple midpoint isotrap. So, a triple isotrap is 3 midpoints conjunct or opposition to each other. Very simple. All planets in the midpoints must be different. So, for example, Sun-Moon midpoint equals Mercury-Mars midpoint equals Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. Again, equals means conjunct or opposition. That's a triple isotrap. But if you see Sun-Moon midpoint equals Mercury-Mars equals Mars-Saturn, that's not a triple isotrap because you see Mars twice. All 6 planets in these midpoint alignments must be different. So when a planet appears in 2 or more midpoint structures, such as Mars in this case, it is why we already learned what's going on. There's a conjunction. In this case, Mercury-Mars and Mars-Saturn means that Mercury is conjunct Saturn. So when you see a planet repeated, you know you don't have an isotrap. And what you do have is the planets are conjunct. Because if Mars-Mercury midpoint is the same as Mars-Saturn, that means Mercury and Saturn are essentially the same, which means they're conjunct. Just so you know what's happening. And that's still powerful, by the way. This is still a very powerful configuration, but not as powerful as a triple isotrap. Triple isotrap is super powerful when the orbs are really small. So, and what would you do? What would you call it if you had 4? Well, we call it quadruple, like 4 midpoints or 5 midpoints. Well, if you're only using Sun through Pluto, and you're not using any, asteroids or minor planets, or you're not including these mid-ever nodes, you've only got 10 planets. It's very unlikely you're going to have a quintuple isotrap, because that would require 10 planets. But if you're using other points, it becomes more possible. But in any case, a quintuple isotrap. So you can get used to this terminology. Think about it. Quintuple isotrap just means 5 isotrap. What's 5? There are 5 midpoints. 5 midpoints involved. And when we go above 5, we no longer use a fancy word. When we get to 6, if that should ever happen, it would be extraordinarily rare. If you're using a lot of different points, it could happen. But just so you know, in case that ever should come up, we call it a 6-tuple, and a 7 would be 7-tuple. So beyond 5, we just call it 6-tuple. I mean, we could call it sextuple and septuple for 7, and octuple for 8. And I know we can do that, but we don't. Just because we're not trying to impress anybody. We're just trying to keep this simple. And I think up to quintuple is kind of nice. And once you get to 6, it's hard to distinguish the words and whatever. So just call it 6-tuple, 7-tuple, 8-tuple. That's what we're doing. Of course, you're hardly ever going to encounter that anyway. If you get a triple isotrap, that's already unusual and very powerful. Okay, but that's the terminology. Very simple. By the way, we don't have a term double isotrap. There's an isotrap, and then there's a triple isotrap. There's not a double isotrap, because an isotrap is two midpoints. It means two midpoints are aligned, so it's already double. So you have an isotrap, and then the next thing you would have is a triple isotrap. So that's something to be aware of that, might confuse a beginner. They might think like, well, why is there no such thing as a double isotrap? Because an isotrap by definition has two midpoints. A triple isotrap has three midpoints. A quadruple isotrap has four midpoints. When we say triple isotrap, it's not the number of isotraps. It's the number of midpoints making the isotrap. Because with a triple isotrap, you have a Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, you have a Sun, Moon, Jupiter, Saturn, you have Mercury, Mars, Jupiter. Well, you probably have three isotraps in that case, but when you have four, you have more than four actual isotraps, so many combinations of midpoints. My point is this: triple isotrap does not mean there are three isotraps overlaying. It means there are three midpoints aligned. Three midpoints. And that's going to make however many isotraps it will make, which I'm not going to get into right now. But so I just want to make that clear, how this works. Okay. And again, how would you see this? You would see this by going to that harmonic patterns listing number 1, which we looked at before in a previous video in this series, and you will see these midpoints. Now here is one that I produced for myself, and I have a question for you to test your understanding of this. If we allow a 1 degree orb, can you find a triple isotrap? And it may take some time to find it. So this listing could take a little bit of time because it's not. You'll see why. Can you find the triple isotrap? Give you a second to start. Can you find it? Well, let's start at the top. Moon, Saturn, Mars, Neptune. How would I find the next? What I would have to find, I'll show on the next slide. Does Venus, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus combine with this? Which of these could combine together? I show it on the next slide. You would see the same midpoint repeated. Moon, Mercury is opposition Jupiter, Neptune with a 28-minute orb, and Moon, Mercury is conjunct Venus, Uranus with a 44-minute orb. So the way that you would find a triple isotrap is by seeing the same midpoint repeated. And with so many midpoints, I happen to have a lot of isotraps. We saw that Julia Roberts had only one within a 15-minute orb. So if it's a chart like mine where there are a lot of isotraps, it's going to be very tedious to find them. So we're going to be adding some new features to make it easier. But in a listing, it's going to look like Moon, Mercury opposite Jupiter, Neptune, Moon, Mercury conjunct Venus, Uranus. I should say, let me say the more clearly, Moon, Mercury midpoint, opposition Jupiter, Neptune midpoint, and Moon, Mercury midpoint, conjunct Venus, Uranus midpoint. Same midpoint means you have a triple isotrap. And that also means that Venus, Uranus midpoint must be aligned with Jupiter, Neptune. But let's see if it is. It's way down. If we go to the next slide and we continue the listing, it's way down here with a 1 degree 12-minute orb. Venus, Uranus, opposition, Jupiter, Neptune, midpoint. Let me pull all this together for you. What's happening is this. Here's the chart. And let me show you what's going on. Make this clear. What's happening? There's the Moon, I've drawn the line of symmetry, this big purple line. I actually spent a lot of time making this diagram, and I think it makes it very clear with all these colors and everything. This is the line of symmetry. The Moon, Mercury midpoint. This line of symmetry looks like it's probably around 6 degrees or 7 degrees Gemini, somewhere around there, is the midpoint of Moon and Mercury. It's also the midpoint of Venus and Uranus. And I've drawn a red isotrap. You see that isosceles trapezoid? That's the isosceles trapezoid formed by Venus, Mercury, Moon, and Uranus. So this is my natal chart. This would be affecting who I am, what I do, my personality has this isotrap. And then there's a third midpoint, the Jupiter-Neptune. So the Jupiter-Neptune is also on this line of symmetry about 7 or 8 degrees Gemini and Sagittarius. Jupiter-Neptune midpoint is going to be up here around 7 or 8 Sagittarius. So all three midpoints, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Uranus, Jupiter-Neptune, on this symmetry axis. And so we end up with 3 isotraps because as I already showed you, the red one, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Uranus, that's the red one. Then the green one, which is Jupiter-Neptune midpoint with Moon, Mercury. And then the blue one, which is Jupiter-Neptune with Venus, Uranus. 3 isotraps. When you get 3 isotraps from 3 midpoints, that's the way it works out. And just copying and pasting from the listing onto here on the right side and just writing it out this way, we have the Moon-Mercury midpoint, opposition the Jupiter-Neptune midpoint, 28-minute orb. Remember that was shown to us in this listing right here. Moon-Mercury midpoint opposition Jupiter-Neptune, 28 minutes. Here's the Moon-Mercury conjunct Venus-Uranus, 44 minutes. And here's the third one. Venus-Uranus midpoint opposition Jupiter-Neptune midpoint, 1 degree, 12 minutes. I've pulled all 3 of those together and summarized it here. I've also color-coded it to show that the Moon-Mercury midpoint is involved in 2 isotraps. You see the red. The Jupiter-Neptune midpoint is involved in 2 isotraps. And the Venus-Uranus midpoint is involved in 2 isotraps. That's just what happens. What happens if you have 3 midpoints aligned? If you have 3 midpoints aligned, as I do in my natal chart, you will get 3 isotraps. And each midpoint will be in 2 different isotraps. It's just kind of curious. This is not critically important for your interpretation, but it's just good to see how this happens, because this is a very powerful configuration if the orbs are small enough. Now notice this. If you add the 28-minute orb here, plus the 44-minute orb, what are you going to get? 44 plus 28 is 72. 72 reduced to degrees of minutes is 1 degree, 12 minutes. So it makes sense. The 2 orbs added together will equal the third orb. So my question earlier was, can you find the isotraps? Not easy to find in that listing. Find the triple isotraps. But there it is. And only 2 of the 3 are within a 1 degree orb. If I'm allowing a 1.5 degree orb, they're all within orb. Suppose I allow a 1 degree orb. Here's my question. Is this a triple isotrap? Is this a triple isotrap? So I have Moon, Mercury, conjunct Venus, Uranus, opposite Jupiter, Neptune. If I allow a 1 degree orb, well, not quite, because this one's not. So it's not a triple isotrap. But it's almost a triple isotrap. And we have a term for that. And the term is, we call it spreading. So here's the actual midpoints. Venus, Uranus, midpoint 6 Gemini 08. Moon, Mercury 6 Gemini 52. Jupiter, Neptune 7 Sag 20. That's where they actually are. If you go to the midpoint listing in the software and you will, well, let me do it very quickly. I'll just do it very, very quickly. Let me pull up my chart just to show you just to make sure you're following this. So there's my chart. Let me make this visible on the screen. And I'll go over here and I will select midpoints and view change, and I'll do the 360-degree sort. And there you'll see it. If there's the moon Mercury at 6 Gemini 52, Venus Uranus at 6 Gemini 08. If I expand this out so you can read it a little bit better. Now you can probably read that. Venus Uranus 6 Gemini 08, Moon Mercury 6 Gemini 52. Let me say that properly. Venus Uranus midpoint 6 Gemini 08, Moon Mercury midpoint 6 Gemini 52, and there's the Jupiter Neptune midpoint 7 Sag 20. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. There they are. They're the midpoint to midpoint orbs. There are the positions. If you subtract these, the difference between Venus, Uranus, and Moon, Mercury, you'll get that orb, 44 minutes. If you subtract this, you'll get the 28 minutes. And if you subtract 7 Sag 20 from 6 Gemini 08, you'll get the 1 degree 12 minutes. So that's actually, you can see exactly what's going on. So we can see that the orbs are correct. We've validated. I'm just showing you what actually is going on, how you can confirm what's going on by looking at the listing of midpoints and confirming for yourself that what the program is telling you is correct. And then so if we allow a 1 degree orb, then one of the 3 midpoint alignments is out of orb, and we call it a spreading triple isotrap. This is the last point for this video. This is part 4. For last point for part 4 in this series of videos is that the word spreading means that one of the orbs has gone beyond what you're allowing. If you're allowing a 1 degree orb, this is a spreading triple isotrap. If you allow a 1.5 degree orb, it's a triple isotrap. They're all within orb. What if you allow a 1/2 degree orb? If you allow a 1/2 degree orb, then only Moon, Mercury is opposite in Jupiter, Neptune. You just have an isotrap. What if you allow a 20-minute orb? Then none of this exists. Okay, so depending on what orb you have, you'll have, obviously more things if you're allowing bigger orb. But with a 1 degree orb, we almost have a triple isotrap. We call it spreading. And we do this with everything. You can do it with aspects. You have a grand trine and 2 of the trines are with an orb. 1 is out of orb. We call it a spreading grand trine. The word spreading means spreading out of orb. And you only allow 1 aspect or midpoint structure, whatever it is, or midpoint to midpoint, whatever it is you have to be looking at. With isotraps, it's midpoint to midpoint. Only 1 is allowed to be out of orb for that part of the configuration. You can end up having, like suppose you have another midpoint that's at 7 Sag 30, then you can have 4 midpoints in a very spreading configuration where maybe none of them make a complete, perfect midpoint isotrap, a perfect triple isotrap. So when you start getting more and more, it's hard to specify all the details briefly. You'd have to explain it out, exactly what's going on. But if it's 3, if it's a triple isotrap, you can simply say it's a spreading triple isotrap. If it's a quadruple isotrap and 1 or more spread out of orb, you just say it's a spreading quadruple isotrap, and then you might have to be more specific. It includes, a complete isotrap or whatever. Anyway, when you get huge complex patterns, you have to break it down into pieces. Bottom line, you get huge patterns, you have to break it into pieces, describe the pieces. But if it's just 3 like this, and we'll see other configurations, you can just call it spreading triple isotrap. Okay, and we'll use this word spreading a lot. We use it for aspect patterns all the time, and for any kind of configuration, because very often you'll have a configuration that is almost there, like this. One thing is out of orb, and we call it spreading. Spreading is much weaker, much, much weaker than if it's not spreading. But it's, it's still there, and we still want to be aware of it because it is giving some inclination to certain behaviors and talents and problems and whatever in the person's life. So we do want to be aware of the spreading patterns, but they're much weaker than if it's not spreading. So this is a spreading triple midpoint isotrap. There it is. So question, is this configuration in my chart using a 1 degree orb, a triple isotrap? Answer, it is a spreading triple isotrap. And as I mentioned, configurations like grand trines, T-squares, grand crosses can all be spreading. So we use the term a lot. Okay. All right, and this just says, as mentioned earlier, it's possible to have 4. Of course, you can have 4 aligned planets, 5, 6, etc. Okay. Okay, so in the next video, we'll pick up with quadruple midpoint isotraps and more about spreading triple midpoint isotraps. So, this is midpoint isotraps. So we've discussed isotraps, and the next thing will be midpoint isotraps. And, sorry, let me just say this here. It's just one slide. Everything I said about isotraps applies to midpoint isotraps. That's all I want to say. Everything we said about isotraps applies to midpoint isotraps. Well, let me read it from the slide. As described earlier, a midpoint isotrap is an isotrap with an additional planet at the line of symmetry of the isotraps. So this planet at the line of symmetry is the focal planet of the midpoint structures. We've already explained that. So just as with isotraps, it is possible to have a quadruple midpoint isotrap, a quintuple midpoint isotrap. You can have spreading midpoint isotraps. Everything we said about isotraps applies to midpoint isotraps because a midpoint isotrap is just an isotrap with a planet at the line of symmetry making all these midpoints. That's all it is in terms of terminology, but it's huge in terms of interpretation. A midpoint isotrap is gigantically powerful when the orbs are small. It's one of the most powerful things you can have in a chart is a midpoint isotrap with small orbs. That's how strong it is. Isotraps are also important. Midpoint structure is important. Midpoint isotrap, when the orbs are very tight, down below about 20 minutes, it's huge. We know this from experience, and it makes sense theoretically that you have all of these huge number of resonances going on. Okay, next video, which will be part 5. So in part 5 of this series of videos on terminology and notation, we're going to look at some powerful midpoint configurations. Oh, this is fascinating. This is very important stuff on how you build powerful midpoint configurations. We don't build them. they're out there in the sky. How they're built from the way they line up, very, very important. And this is where we've done some simplifying of terminology more recently. Okay, thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.